Yep.
Tēnā rā koutou katoa kanei te mihi kia koutou. Welcome to today's session entitled Culturally Informed Solidarity and Engagement, Working Within and Across Community Boundaries. Just first like to start by thanking the conference organisers, particularly given the chaotic year that we've had with COVID and the pivot from moving from an in-person conference to an online conference. I'm not completely sure about everyone's circumstances around the world, but particularly here in Oceania, we know that people over in Melbourne have been doing it pretty tough. So just want to acknowledge all the hard work that's gone on behind the scenes to get this conference together. A lot of the people whose names won't be mentioned who are in the background with busy hands, making sure that we can all kind of come together and have these symposium, have these corridors. So yeah, thank you to all those people helping out. So yeah, my name's Pita. I'm part of a research group based here at Massey University, and my co-presenters today, Ahnya and Jony, are also here at Massey University. And so we're going to basically talk for about 10 minutes each, and then open the floor for discussions and conversations. And I mean, we do want to use this time up, but we would much prefer to have a frank conversation amongst people. But we also don't want to only just present a little bit of stuff and then everyone's quiet. So really encourage you to be vocal, to post some questions as the presentations are coming, because the more questions and engagements we see happening when we're presenting, the quicker we'll kind of get through our presentations and we can just get into having a bit of a group conversation around these sorts of things. So does that format make sense? Everyone happy? Cool. So I'll kick things off with my little rant. We'll move to Ahnya and then to Jony. So screen share. Does that screen look all right? Cool. So my presentation is called Colonial Urbanality Towards Preserving the Complexities of Being Māori. Also like to acknowledge some of my co-researchers who are on this project, Professor Darren Hodgetts, Mohirua and Mandy Morgan. A lot of their support, you know, made a lot of this research possible, but they've just told me to go and present the stuff by myself, but they're definitely a huge part of this research, and just want to acknowledge their contributions. Next, so for a brief overview, I've got one slide looking at the context of research. I'm going to try and not labour the point around this because a lot of it is, I think, stuff that, particularly within community psychology and Indigenous and minoritized groups, these are facts of society, facts of reality that many of us have to face, and every society kind of has these stories around inequality. So I just want to point across to those briefly to provide the context, without dwelling too much on the misery aspects of coloniality and poverty, although these things are important contextual factors. I then got a slide looking at the approach that we've taken, but to try and put things simply, what I want to talk about today is just two things really. One is around space and the other is around everyday practices. Now this presentation is kind of funny because it's part of a project that I've presented. This will be now the third time that I've presented at the Community Psychology Conference, because back in 2016 in Durban, I presented a sort of theory conceptual piece that opened up the project. In Chile, I did stuff around the initial empirical findings from some of the community engagements. Now this project's been wrapped up and I'm actually providing a bit of a sort of reflection on it. So hopefully this is the last time you guys have to see this presentation at the Community Psychology Conference, and that 2 years from now we'll have something completely new. So to provide a bit of context for this research, within New Zealand we've got one of the highest urbanisation rates in the world, around 87%. And particularly for Māori, this was a rapid urbanisation that took place after World War II. So around 1945 up until the 70s, there was a massive exodus of Indigenous peoples from our ancestral homelands into the cities. And a lot of this was to boost the labour force, but it was also for Māori trying to find better opportunities, employment, educational opportunities. But another big part of it was the New Zealand government's efforts post-World War II to free up land to make it more productive, as they like to say. And as we've seen in many parts of the world, policies like this continued the ongoing process of colonisation that Indigenous peoples have been experiencing for centuries now. And in New Zealand, it was no different. A lot of it was posed for the better of society, the better of New Zealand society as a whole, but you know, one side of the coin sort of paid the price, and other people reaped the benefits. And as a result of these colonial practices, Māori are overrepresented in low socioeconomic urban environments, low paid wages, the precariat, things like that. And as numerous scholars have outlined, cities within modern society have become intense repositories for the human condition that can be characterized by intense hardships, inequalities, and things like that. So within this presentation, within this project, one of the key focuses that I wanted to look at, or that I did look at, was this idea of stretching between the urban and the rural, because for Māori, many of us are in this in-between place of intergenerationally of being taken from our ancestral homelands and having to find new ways of existing within city spaces. And I draw on the work here of Kasim, Stalter and Hodgetts, who did some work around transnational migration. I really sort of took to this idea of stretching across space, and that when you move from one space to another, it's not that you're instantly disconnected, because when we move across spaces, we inevitably reproduce those ways of being somewhere new. So we're not disconnected or dislocated completely. Who we are as people often get stretched across space and time. So as you can see in this photo, that's Rosie the pig. It's relevant, I promise, but we'll get to that. So as I mentioned, in this project, there are two key locations. One was Highbury, and this is the urban, or the city that I was born in. So I was a first generation Māori born into the city. My father was born and raised on our ancestral homelands. So I was interested in doing an ethnographic approach to trying to understand what are the complexities of being Māori. So there was Highbury, the city, and then the Hokianga, which is where my father was from, where our ancestral homelands are. So it took an ethnographic approach. Reflective journaling was very, very useful in documenting the everyday practices and things that we did across these different locations. And for those who made it to the presentation yesterday on the panel discussion that Darren and I did, around the relational ethics and principal practice stuff. A really important part of the way that we work within settings like this is to make sure that as researchers we take time to spend time with others, that we're not kind of rushing the process or just there to extract data. And this is exemplified in the idea that relationships come first, and then the research emerges from that, right? So we're not there just to do the research. First and foremost, we're there to build and maintain relationships, and if the research takes place after that, that's awesome. If not, well, you know, we just spent a nice day walking a pig out in the country. So conceptually, in terms of making sense of the materials, which were photographs, interviews, and little snippets from everyday interactions, field notes and things like that, we drew on Levi Strauss's idea of the bricoleur to piece together different parts of the empirical materials to make sense of everyday life. And in doing so, we draw on Zimmel's idea of extracting general arguments out of detailed consideration of everyday events. And so the two examples around space and everyday practice that I want to present within this presentation is an example of that in process. So to look at place, to look at space, we played with this idea of Auntie's house as a way of understanding how Māori have come to retexture the urban environment that is characterized by settler society and to becoming a place more homely for being Māori. And in here we can see we've got a quote from one of my aunties who was one of the first local Māori in that area to move in. Did an interview with her around what that place means for her and her family, and she said, you know, why do we all live in Highbury? It's because that's where all my family that came out from the country. That's why it's quite special, Highbury. So it's almost like the marae came to the city. Now the marae for Māori is kind of the epicenter of village life. It's where our dining halls are, our meeting houses. It's a very sacred place that's the ultimate expression of our tribal or sub-tribal identity. And within the quote from my auntie, she was talking about the process of urbanization wasn't just individuals kind of coming into town, but how that social formation kind of uprooted itself and moved into the city. Let's see, that here. So this links to something that Te Awe Kotuku, who was on the panel this morning, talked about, where She talked about the marae not just being a physical location, but also being about when Māori come together for Māori purposes under Māori protocol, the marae being formed. So the marae is just as much about the people as about the space, but it's not one or the other, it's kind of both. And so Auntie's house was an interesting way for us to conceptualize how Māori had taken this kind of ancient traditional social formation that was embedded within place and brought it into a city that was designed by settler society, but reshaped it into a place for being Māori. Now, for those who were at the, who caught our talk yesterday, we played with this idea of pauwhirinaki, and this is something that Mohirua has been developing around the pillars of the community. And this term is used to refer to a person, but this concept links to Auntie's house in that pauwhirinaki aren't just kind of people that float around. They're often, they have these sorts of homes, and Auntie's houses in places like Highbury, which are predominantly Māori, predominantly poor. These are the sorts of places where children who are having a bit of a hard time with family life or getting a hiding or facing some problems, these are the community homes that Māori children will go to when they need a feed or when they need a hug or when they need to talk to someone before they go home to get a hiding or any of these sorts of things. And I think as researchers, we need to really be attuned to how communities already have these structures that are meaningful and how as researchers we can actually tap into rather than disrupt these places. Now, the second concept that I wanted to look at was around everyday practices. And I mean, one of the key findings from the ethnographic research that we did was this kind of contrasting between these big cultural events in terms of how Indigenous people who are now urbanized reconnect with their tribal traditions. And these are very well documented, things like weddings or funerals or big cultural celebrations. But within my research, what I wanted to focus on was the small everyday ways that we maintain our connections to Indigenous or to our ancestral homelands. And as you can see in the images here, there's a picture of our wharenui. This is our marae up home. You got a picture of my sister with some bread that's, what's the word? Not fermenting, but when it, she knows that stuff. You got a proof, that's the one, proofing. And then on the bottom, you've got it cooking. Now, what's interesting about this bread is that as we started to go home more often, whānau started to teach my sister this bread. And this bread has been in the family for many, many years. And quite luckily, the timing that we went back, that we were able to learn this bread because only a few years after my sister had kind of perfected it, the nanny that taught her this bread had passed away. And what was interesting about this sort of everyday practice that's very sort of mundane and not spectacular is that the role of making bread within the whānau completely changed when our nan passed away and her bread was no longer on the table. And so I guess one of the things that I wanted to emphasize within this, this project was how these small everyday ways of reproducing and maintaining connections can be sometimes overshadowed by the big things. So it's not to say that we should forget the big things, but let's not forget the small things. So closing remarks. I wanted to end with a quote from Stevens, Garth Stevens, who's also quite coincidentally did a presentation this morning, where he talks about preserving the complexity of something. And so what they were writing about in this text was around blackness. And you know, this quote always stuck with me, this idea of preserving the complexities as opposed to kind of narrowing or oversimplifying. And so I think preserving the complexities of the phenomena that we engage with within psychology itself constitutes an act of resisting coloniality, and that we need to avoid attempts to kind of produce neat and tidy accounts of the complex life worlds and ways of being that we engage with. And just to sort of close off, hopefully I know I'm going over time, so I'm sorry, around the complexities of being Māori. This is a wharenui on a marae in Palmerston North. Palmerston North is where I grew up, and this marae is 1,000 kilometers away from my ancestral homelands. Right? So in terms of tribal identification and who has sovereignty of this land, I'm not from here, but this is the marae I grew up on. Now it's also interesting, if you look at the top, it's got a cross. So it is a marae, but it's also an Anglican church. Now I'm not an Anglican, I was raised Catholic. So not only am I Catholic and a Māori from another tribal space, this is actually my marae. But if we look at it from a Pākehā perspective, or European, or even from a traditional Māori perspective, I can't say that I'm from here. But in terms of my lived experiences, in terms of how I my body was placed within a physical location and the everyday social practices that I was raised with, I can't not say that this is my marae. And that's a complexity that I think that we need to preserve when we do our work. So without further ado, I'll shut up and I will pass it on to my co-presenter, Ahnya Martin. Kia ora, Ahnya.
Sorry, I'm just getting out of this. Kia ora koutou. I'm Ahnya Martin, currently at Massey University, the land of Ngāti Whātua. I am from the iwi Tainui, which is in the Waikato, also of Scottish descent, but I'm married into Ngāti Whātua as well, which I'd just like to give thanks to the people Ngāti Whātua before I begin. So is this coming up okay, everybody? Yep. All right, so today I'm going to be speaking about some work I did for my master's research and looking at welfare and single Māori mothers in the media, symbolic power in the case of Matiria Ture. So I'd like to just give thanks to my supervisors at Massey University, had Darren and Pita. I also did an internship prior to the master's through Ngāpai o Te Maramatanga, New Zealand's Māori Centre of Research Excellence, and also to those from Waikato University, some of which are here today, so thank you for coming along. And basically I'm going to skip over the first few slides quite quickly in terms of the media, and I'm really wanting to focus today on my engagement within Wahine Māori and the community. All right, so to begin and to provide some context here, Matiria Ture was a former Green Party co-leader, the political party here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In July 2017, she came forward during a political campaign and admitted to committing benefit fraud when she was a young single parent. She had boarders or flatmates, so people living with her that were helping her with rent at that time, and she didn't disclose it to our what we call work and income, so social welfare service. So Matiria came forward to highlight problems within the current welfare system in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and to call for systemic change. She could see, and the party could see, that there were significant inadequacies, that our social safety net was not working as it should be, and single parents were really struggling. And so she came forward to admit this benefit fraud, to really kickstart a conversation and create some change. So what I did is first part of my master's thesis was looking at the media. How did the media respond to Matiria's admission here? And so from there, I created a plot synopsis. I'm just going to go through this quite quickly. So basically, I traced how the story unfolded within multi-platform news media, looking across blogs, social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, New Zealand Herald, one of our national newspapers. So I collated about 366 news pieces. I plotted how the story evolved over time. And then I categorized each of these news pieces into 3 categories, which I drew from the work of Rappaport on tales of terror, so hegemonic colonial constructions of Māori, balanced tales, so these were balanced media representations within the media. However, I must note that there were very few of these and more of the tales of terror. And then tales of joy. So what I'm going to focus on heavily today is the Māori counter-hegemonic self-constructions. So just drawing on the concept of symbolic power, which is what I did throughout my thesis. So media are implicated in symbolic power. They have a lot of power to name and define others. We can see that within our context, it's embedded in the hegemony or dominance of settler culture, so Pākehā, British culture, colonial. And we've seen this historically and in modern times, which is what I was looking at. So the voices of Indigenous groups such as Māori continue to be marginalised for political and ideological reasons within the media. And I really wanted to have a look at how this promoted stereotypes or negative stereotypes of groups such as Māori single mothers and welfare recipients. So I did all of that in my thesis. I looked at the media and I looked quite heavily at all of the tales of terror and things like that. And that was quite a significant part. But what was really important to me was engaging with wahine Māori like me. And so this is a picture here of me and my daughter going back 12 years ago. She's almost 13. So at 21 years old, I had a child on my own. I had to go into welfare and was on a domestic purposes benefit myself. So I have some lived experience of what it's like and the issues that Matidia was raising. So just to provide some context there, this was my journey, and I really brought that forth into the research, wanting to understand how other wahine experienced these issues that Matidia was trying to raise and that the media had commented so heavily on. So in order to recruit my participants, I drew from 2 communities that I have strong relationships with. You see here a little house. This is in the north of Auckland. It's the Women's Centre Rodney. I was a young mums group facilitator for over a year there. I would run classes every Thursday with a group of young mothers, so 24 and under. Some of them were solo parents, others were in relationships. It didn't really matter. It was just a group to come forward, learn some new skills, to connect and engage with others. I'm now on the board there as things got busier with study and actually moving forth and having more children myself. I decided to stay connected. So this was one of the key places within the community in which I was able to recruit some of my participants. And then secondly, Te Rau Pōwai, which is a Māori mental health workforce scholarship here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and they are with Massey University, so they help and have been for over 20 years to increase the Māori workforce. So I am part of what we call their whānau there, our wider family, and I'm connected and have been for a number of years as a recipient of their scholarships. So this was another place in which I have relationships, and I was able to engage and recruit some of my participants. So I held a couple of focus groups, 2 focus groups consisting of about 8 wahine. So what I wanted to do was focus on their tales, focus on the links between what we were viewing in the media and the dominant narratives that occur within the public about marginalised communities, but then to see how marginalised communities themselves story themselves. So their tales of joy in opposition to the hegemonic narratives that were very dominant. And I must add here that it was a very intense period of 3 weeks and 3 days in which the dominant narratives were coming out day in, day out, multiple times a day from some commentators in particular. So it was a very intense time. So I played some of the snippets of Matedia's admission to the participants, and then I let them discuss it between themselves. So one of the main themes that I saw come through here first was that my participants reacted to Matedia's admission with understanding and empathy, as her sentiments also reflected their own lived experience of income, housing, and food-related insecurities due to the inadequacies of the welfare system. So we were really talking here about looking at Matedia's admission and what their initial reactions were. And I have a quote here. I find it's a survival mechanism. There is no other way really. Who can survive on a benefit? And like, if you don't do things like have a flatmate or maybe get some work under the table, and by that we mean work without putting it through the government and paying tax, so cash work. It's just like if you relate it back to the animal world, what a lion would do for its cubs, it's the same thing as a mother or as a single parent. You will do anything to ensure that your child is fed, clothed, and has a roof over their head. You just do anything. So this was quite a strong theme here, in that they really resonated with what Matidia was saying. They could understand the hardships, and they knew that they were having to do what they had to do in order to feed and house their children. So the commentators drew on aspects of the hegemony perspective, so tales of terror, that framed people who access welfare support as failed citizens or denizens, so often as welfare queens, dole bludgers, things like that, who intentionally, or as they would like to try and create within their narratives, simply choose to commit welfare fraud and therefore cannot be trusted and require management. This was a very significant theme within the media or mainstream media. So what happened here within my focus groups, or what I noticed, was that Wahine appeared to resist this hegemonic tale of terror that featured dysfunctional, immoral, criminal, and undeserving welfare recipients as they were made out. So they would say things such as, I think they have this idea that people who are sole parents, that they are dole budgers, they're already poor, they choose to have a child on their own, they don't have a relationship, and then like nobody who is the sole parent must have been married or forbid, had a marriage breakup or have lost their husband. So for example, if their husband left or passed away. So they were really resisting that notion that they simply are poor and they simply choose to go on a benefit. So down the bottom here we can see conservative commentators just have this idea that they were young mothers who got knocked up or pregnant and didn't want to work. So they really heavily resisted that notion. So Wahine proposed that such coverage that they were seeing, the tales of terror, feeds prejudicial views of Wahine and can contribute to discrimination when Wahine try to secure employment. So often within tales of terror, we would see that commentators would say things like they just need to go to work, they just need to get an education. And the Wahine resisted this and fought back by saying, when you actually talk about beneficiaries this way within the media and create those narratives, it denigrates you, it impacts the way you feel when you go for job interviews, and it pushes stereotypes into the community and then they're frowned upon. So it's really counterproductive in what they're doing in the media. Just check my time here. All right, so another theme that came through was that Wahine also questioned the lack of expertise on the part of the leading commentators and proposed that they do not understand the everyday dilemmas low-income Wahine Māori face. They recognised that conservative commentators wield considerable power over the media framing of issues, poverty and welfare, and noticed that there was significant amount of coverage from these commentators within Aotearoa, who notably were generally elites, Pākehā men. So they were questioning their expertise, that how did they understand what they were going through, how was it that they had the position to be able to name and define these issues. So it makes me wonder, is it your privilege and class that makes you disregard the other side of the argument, or is it the sensationalism of promoting an agenda that's persecuting and shocking? Is that what it is? And they really had discussions around power and recognised that what Matiria had done was shake the status quo. Those within the media didn't like it, or the dominant media, and they understood that had challenged their power. So just finally now moving to the end, Wahine provided a counter-hegemonic narrative or tale of joy that worked to reposition themselves and other welfare recipients as reluctant users of a failing welfare system. So they were doing everything they could to survive. They were trying to engage in education, further employment, better themselves, and do everything that the media commentators truly were trying to say they had to, yet it was still never enough. So I've got a little quote down the bottom which encapsulates how one of our wahine would go to work to earn extra money, and then she would be penalised for doing so. So it actually cost her money in the end. So two main themes that came out and really stood out for me was that wahine within the focus groups use the items provided as talking points to directly challenge the power of these men and the media commentators, and to name and define Māori woman. And despite the hegemony of the conservative narrative evident within both focus groups, was that the wahine resistance and refusal to be silenced, subjugated or internalised the negative stereotypes of Māori being produced in these commentaries. So they really did resist, and it was interesting to see how that all unfolded. And there's a lot to it, so I better hurry up and wrap this up. And finally, in terms of getting these stories out there, I was able to be accepted into the Rutledge Companion to Media and Poverty handbook this year. So some of the work from my thesis is going into that. All right, thank you. Hopefully that was okay for time.
Thank you, Ahnya. Yeah, I think one thing that I really like about Ahnya's work is this idea of the sort of two-way directionality of the media space now, and how, you know, Māori mothers aren't just these kind of passive beings that are being talked about are actually on social media being quite quite in your face. I think one of the most beautiful things I've seen in Ahny's thesis was a quote around a comment in the comment sections to one of the political commentators that just simply said, "Get fucked, Paddy." And, you know, we all had a good giggle about that. So thank you, Ahnya. So moving on, Jony, introduce yourself in there.
Thank you very much, Pita. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Jony. If you notice my middle and my last name, you will familiar that I'm a Japanese from Indonesia. And yeah, I'm now in Messi University doing my PhD, and yeah, extending Pita and Ahnya presentation. I'm going to present my research on everyday inter-ethnic marriages in Indonesia. And of particular interest, I will explore shared material practices within inter-ethnic marriages between Javanese and Chinese Indonesian. So this reflects the majority ethnic groups and the minority ethnic groups. I will discuss how seemingly contradictory cultural differences from the perspective of ideology can work harmoniously together when they are woven together in the conduct of everyday lives experiences by married couples. This is to give us background about this presentation. So Indonesia is a culturally diverse country, and we have more than 600 ethnic groups with more than 600 local languages, and adding further cultural complexities and nuances into everyday lives. More than 11% of the 47 million marriages in Indonesia are inter-ethnic. And generally speaking, there are two main research traditions into inter-ethnic marriage internationally. The first one is quantitative traditions that is focused on the correlates and predictors of marital satisfactions. And generally speaking, these research traditions depict inter-ethnic marriage in more negative tones, like forbidden or discouraged, or it has a higher tensions and lower marital satisfaction compared to the intra-ethnic marriage. And this research is focused and the second research tradition is qualitative and explores the reason why some persons enter inter-ethnic marriage. And my research is focused on the second research traditions, that is qualitative, and locating this exploration primarily within the second enable me to focus on materiality and the everyday conduct of inter-ethnic marriage. Because exploring the everyday use of money with the research participant using various ethnographic and visual techniques inform my understanding about the instrumental role of memory objects in invoking meanings and feelings that are often difficult to articulate. In terms of the context, the research setting, it is important to consider that actually the relationship between a Javanese and a Chinese Indonesian, they have a prolonged historical context. So in the past, there have been considerable tensions between Javanese majority and Chinese minority. Like, for example, in the past, we have experienced 1965 anti-Chinese violence, and also 1998 anti-Chinese violence. So this tension remains part of the national psyche, and proof that pribumi or indigenous and non-pribumi, or relationship between indigenous and non-indigenous in terms of intimate relationships, could easily be ignited. And this is, for example, the recent survey by Setiadi revealed that 30% of the 1,500 respondents still unsure, and another 30% have no comments if it is appropriate for Chinese Indonesian to marry pribumi. So it's actually important for us to conduct the fieldwork for this project with the Chinese Indonesian colleagues. So I invite my Chinese Indonesian colleague to help me with the interview, and also actually the paper written from this project is also include a senior Chinese scholars as well. And the fieldwork for this project involved considerable face-to-face establishing relationships with the participated couples. And actually I recruit the participating couples through a local kindergarten whose role feature a high number of inter-ethnic children. And given the rich and complex nature of the materials produced from this fieldwork, my presentation is based on my engagement with two couples. The first is Bing and Kiatun household, and the second one is Ali and Jayadi's household. These couples were selected because their lower economic status and the emphasis they place on monetary issues and related memory object when narrating their relationships. In total, in terms of the corpus, I work with 67 pages of transcript written in Javanese and Bahasa Indonesia, and more than 84 photographs, 400 personal photographs, 4 genograms, and 32 pages of field notes. This presentation is actually focused on money as a key material object in the relationship and its relationship with other objects in the marriage. Money is a significant object in marriage that's embroiled within our everyday economic, psychological, relational, and cultural practice and associated meanings. Within these marriages, money is an object that's my participating household found it's difficult to obtain, and which function as a focal point for key inter-ethnic tension within their family. So money is an important object through which to explore the aspect of dynamics of inter-ethnic marriage. And in this presentation, I'm going to present some sections that actually document the articulation and materialization of the Chinese values of prudence in turning small money into big money in everyday household practices. And I also will document how a material object like an onion processing machine manufactured through Chinese prudence and it is employed harmoniously within the household to support broader to support Javanese cooking business and cultural obligation to support broader community. And and finally, I will also explore how Javanese prudence in purchasing cheaper cuts of pork contributes to couples' ability to cook bakute and participate in the correct observance of Chinese New Year. So the first one is about small money in the can. So in the first household, in Jayadi and Ali's household, money offers a focal point for cultivating a sense of purpose in the marriage. Cooperation around money is also central to the couples, being able to observe particular cultural practice that each partner brings to their union. And more than just a routine, the practice of saving in this family reproduces Chinese cultural values of being prudent. What it means to be a Chinese is when you being prudent with your money, and determined and entrepreneurial, that are employed to support Javanese cultural values of gifting surplus money to the broader community. Ellie often compare that she is prudence and her husband, Javanese husband, is imprudence, and he often like his understanding about small money and how to transform big money is inform her cultural practices in buying like a freezer or another items for their ice business. So they so Ellie wants to transform the small money to buy something that can generate more money, and this is particular. And this is particularly different with the Japanese cultural value, who tend to use the small money to and becomes lost money because trying to because the husband trying to be like to show the solidarity with the Japanese community and present it as being imprudent. And when referred to this save small money and accumulate it into big money, Ellie actually exemplifies the Chinese saying that it's actually now it's a drop of water, but in the future it's a bowl of water. So it's like actually exemplify Chinese saying. And these cultural tensions actually inform us that money is actually integrated in human relationship as a focal point in negotiating the conduct of everyday relationship. But then actually these couples can resolve this tension. They agree to transform small money into large money, so they can have they can share more with the community and purchase a house. So they shows that money is actually a material object that's negotiated interculturally, and it can be an object of cooperation rather than tensions. And it actually reflects emails that money is integrated in our human interactions. The second one is about the onion processing machine. And in this focus, I focus on how the second household, Bing and Kiatun, responded to their financial hardship by using the money that they have to purchase components so they can repair and use material objects that enable family to cultivate a more harmonious and prosperous life together. From the outside, this onion processing machine is actually in terms of its function to peel and to cut onions, but for this Chinese Indonesian husband is actually an object of affection. It's actually an object of cooperations that binds him and Kiatun, his Japanese wife, within income generating practice and of selling food. So this is how being trying to talk to Kiatun, express his affection that I'm here to support you. I'm here to we might not have money to buy a brand new onion processing machine, but I can create one for you. So this is how actually the object of onion processing machine is an expression of intercultural cooperations and affections, whereby this Chinese husband supported the Japanese cooking practices and sharing values of a Japanese wife. And the third one is still talking about the second household, and in relation preparing for and enacting such aspect of the different cultural heritage. Tension can emerge between partners and also negotiated. Like for example, in certain times, the Chinese Indonesian, they celebrate the Chinese New Year's, and sometimes in some families, in Chinese Indonesian families, they have special dish for celebrating Chinese Indonesian Chinese New Year. But Kiatun, the Japanese wife, realized that this dish is actually too expensive for her, and in evidencing and in materializing the claim, Kiatun, the Japanese wife, often compare it to the Japanese dish, but she actually also recognized that this is truly important for her husband. So that's why they trying to negotiate, and they trying to buy the cheaper pork and and their ongoing deliberation to include considerable effort toward reaching practical compromise within the resource restraint that feature in their life together. This includes the Kiaton suggestions that they cook this dish during an alternative week when the meat and other ingredients came down in price due to reduced demand. But after further negotiations, it was decided not to move the date for cooking bakuteh, but rather to opt for cheaper ingredients. Here, they decided to buy the $1 ears pork, and I witnessed that the purchasing event is actually understood as a shared moment of cooperation and inclusions. So through such interactions, it becomes apparent that these couples often strive to reach intercultural compromises that ensure that their traditions are not lost. And from this presentation, I actually want to emphasize that the first one is the value of doing culturally immersive research to generate nuanced knowledge and of the agentive dynamics and deeply felt conduct of everyday interethnic marriage. And it's also informed us that interethnic marriages comprise liminal or encounter spaces for cultural hybridity, and fusion for participating human beings as they grapple with the material aspect of everyday lives as well as their shared home and dreams. And the use of money reflects how Chinese Indonesian means are used to meet Japanese culture ends, just as Japanese means can be employed to meet Chinese Indonesian culture ends. Certain household items function as object of commitment, compromise, cooperation, and affections that help the couples articulate feeling of affection and care and realize shared aspirations. And the last one, the material practices also enables these couples to share personal memories and tradition from their past and cultivate shared imagination for their life, for their futures together. And we can see here that the reality within the conduct of everyday lives can be different from the survey-based research that often depict interethnic marriage as something discouraged or forbidden in most Indonesian people, particularly between Japanese and Chinese Indonesians. Yeah, that's from me. Pita, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jony. And I think, just to sum up what Jony said, I mean, working with him has been really, really good around the, I guess the one key thing that I've taken away from the research that Jony's done is this idea of cross-cultural difference and how quite often cross-cultural difference is positioned as sort of a deficit or a problem or a point of tension, of which it can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And I think what Jony's work does quite nicely shows how things that, I guess, at that sort of analytic logic level seem to be contradictory, if we embrace the complexity of everyday life and the different life modes that people occupy, these couples actually bring these things together in quite harmonious ways. They're not reading literature, they're not reading the theory, they kind of just get on with it. And I think as researchers, what that means for us is that, we have a lot to learn from the communities that we engage with. So thank you, Jony. I'm mindful that we've only got 3 minutes left, but if there's any dying questions or comments that people want to make, please just unmute yourself and let's have a free-for-all for 3 minutes, 2 minutes. Don't be shy. If there's anything the presenters wanted to say or clarify or point out.
I do have a question. My name is Nancy. I'm in Chicago. And, I fabulous. I've learned so much. Thank you for that. But, and in all of the presentations, I really got the sense that people were able to protect their culture by using the context in which they were in. And what I was unsure of is there how do you do that? Is there a critical mass of people that's necessary for that? Is there was that combined with a particular kind of leadership?
Yes.
What's the formula?
I'm the fourth generation of a group of scholars that come from the University of Waikato. There's a few of us here, Amanda Younghauser and Ottilie. I mean, how would you describe this, Ots, and Amanda, jump in? I just used the term Māori in Psychology Research Unit, but I mean, it's linked to a whole bunch of people who are just collaboratively working together, that we kind of develop an approach that, and I say we in the royal we, but I'm the fourth generation of this, that in order to understand people's psychology, we have to understand the context of their everyday lives. Because if we don't, what are we doing? And in that comes a confidence in being able to assert the ways in which communities make sense of the world themselves. And as scholars, we need to bridge the academic and the lived. Ots, I've seen that you've unmuted yourself. She's a bit higher up in the generational line than me, so.
Yeah, in other words, I'm an old lady. But yeah, I like what you're saying, Pita, and yes, definitely it's been a very sort of fertile collaboration around the Māori Psychology Research Unit. And I think one of the possible things that is sort of entering my head now is the fact that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're at the bottom of the world, we're very peripheral, most of the time we're ignored, unless, you know, it's our Prime Minister or doing something, you know, or her conduct in contrast to other world leaders. But I think, you know, I've been to big international conferences, and you know, we are sort of seen as the exotic other sometimes. I don't know how other colleagues feel about that, but and I'm speaking as a white person, so that's really weird. But I think has been an advantage. In some ways, we've often been overlooked, and in comparison to Northern Hemisphere, which seems to be, you know, where, you know, so big psychology happens, and we've just been left to get on and sort of play down the bottom of the world with some different ideas and foster our own sort of collective response to the dominant discipline. So yeah, that's my thoughts, but others may have other experiences.
I know that we've got limited time. As an intellectual genealogy of what's happening here, some key names are Jamin Jin Ritchie, who linked to the bigger whole tradition of New Zealand. Is it social anthropology? And then from there is Linda Nikora. Ngā hui te awe kotuku is also a very senior member, intellectual higher upon high. And she had a panel discussion this morning, I believe. Darren Hodgetts, Mohirua, Bridget Masters, Amanda. Yeah, it is very much about a critical mass and a sort of mentorship of sort of paying it forward. Yeah, I think your comment, Nancy, around the critical mass, that has been a big part of it, because, you know, we can support each other's work, we can mark each other's theses, we can, you know, examine each other's stuff. You can't do it by yourself, you really can't. Amanda, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I concur with what you said and Ottilie said. I think it's really helpful because it feels isolated otherwise. So we have had massive support from those who have gone before us. And I think they have been fighting, and we are following in their footsteps, and we grow. And because it's a small country, we know each other quite well. The ones who think along the same lines, we know each other and we support each other. And that's a huge advantage.
And although it's called the Māori in Psychology Research, and it was started by Māori, I mean, part of our position as Indigenous peoples in New Zealand is to manaaki or to care fathers. So, I mean, it's a very multicultural group. I mean, Ots is from the Netherlands, Amanda's from Switzerland, Jony's from Indonesia. We've had people from China. I mean, our indigeneity is about caring for others. It's not just about caring for Māori, because if we don't care for everyone, we're only caring for our selected people, something kind of gets lost in the process. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just going to keep talking until we get kicked off. Or should we actually close this? I'm not sure. Does that answer your question, Nancy? Sorry.
Yeah, that was good. I mean, again, what I'm thinking through based on the presentation is that, you know, culture isn't just the big ritual events, it's the way we live our everyday lives. And so the way we construct our everyday lives is actually done in context, whatever that context may be. Yeah. And we create new rituals. I mean, it's really interesting for me to think that through. Yeah, so I appreciate very much the the session here. Thank you.
No worries. If you wanted to know more about this kind of approach, Darren and I did one of the live panel discussions yesterday, panel session 1, where we kind of outlined that a bit more because, I mean, being community psychologists, most of us in our training, a lot of the time we're more interested in actually being useful to our communities. But it's been probably the last 5 or 6 years that this broader group of like-minded scholars are starting to articulate the approach. Because that's quite a tricky thing, is that a lot of it is implicit, implied, culturally nuanced, a very particular embodied knowledge that is very difficult to actually write down into words. But, you know, Mohirua, Darren and co, they're really starting to articulate this approach. So I don't want to take credit for stuff like this because, yeah, as I say, I'm just the 4th generation in this machine. So, kia ora.